What if I told you the next American Civil War has already begun? According to billionaire investor Ray Dalio, it has. He isn't talking about battlefields and armies, but a conflict tearing the nation apart from the inside. And he's warning that we're entering the final chaotic stage. We're going to break down Dalio's chilling analysis and what he believes is coming next. Before we get to the heart of the warning, it's worth knowing who it's coming from. Ray Dalio isn't just some billionaire with an opinion, he's the founder of Bridgewater Associates, a hedge fund he built from his two-bedroom apartment into one of the largest in the world. He's a man who has spent over 50 years playing what he calls the game of global markets, where he gets scored every single day. His success is legendary, but it's built on something deeper than financial skill. It's built on a deep, almost obsessive study of history. Dalio famously predicted the 2008 financial crisis, a call he made by studying the patterns of debt cycles throughout history, especially the Great Depression. His philosophy is built on a powerful idea. What's happening now has happened before. By understanding the mechanics of how history repeats, you can get a sense of what's coming. For him, this isn't just theory. His ideas are tested by real-world markets, where being wrong costs billions. When he looks at the United States today, he sees five powerful forces all being disrupted at once: the economy and debt, internal conflict, external geopolitical conflict, acts of nature like pandemics and climate change, and finally, technology. Dalio believes this convergence is creating an environment eerily similar to the late 1930s, a period of global chaos that led directly to World War II. So when a man with this track record says the US is developing a form of civil war, it's not a statement to take lightly. He isn't a politician scoring points or a pundit chasing ratings. He's a practitioner tested by markets who sees the same historical patterns that led to past collapses playing out right before our eyes. His warning is a diagnosis, and according to him, the patient is in critical condition. When Ray Dalio says civil war, he doesn't mean what you might think. He isn't predicting a traditional fight with organized armies. He's describing something more modern and insidious, a complete breakdown in the ability for people to agree on anything. It's a conflict fought over irreconcilable differences. These are differences so deep that they stop politicians from working together to solve the country's biggest problems. This isn't just a policy debate. It's a fundamental clash of values, a battle for the very soul of the country. Dalio sees a society where populism on both the left and the right has created political figures who are rewarded for fighting, not for compromising. That dynamic corrodes the foundation of a functioning democracy, which depends on shared principles and a willingness to find common ground. The war Dalio describes is being fought on multiple fronts. He points out that the US is already in a financial war, a tech war, and a geopolitical war, but the most dangerous one is the internal civil war of some sort brewing at home. This fight doesn't happen in pitched battles, but in the refusal to accept the other side as legitimate. We see it in the political polarization that turns governing into a zero-sum game. We see it in media echo chambers that create separate realities for different parts of the population. Dalio argues this conflict is supercharged by two things: a massive wealth gap and a cavernous values gap. When a society gets this divided economically and ideologically, conflict is almost inevitable. The top 10% of Americans now own over two-thirds of the country's wealth, while the bottom 50% hold less than 4%. That kind of inequality creates a powerful sense of injustice, a feeling that the system is rigged. When you combine that with deep disagreements over what's right and wrong, true and false, the social fabric just shreds. He calls these moments of intense division tests of power. These are situations where each side pushes the boundaries of the system to see what they can get away with, challenging laws, norms, and even the Constitution. Political opponents are no longer seen as fellow citizens, but as enemies to be defeated. This is the core of his warning. The conflict is already here. The question isn't whether this war will start, but whether it can be stopped before it spirals out of control. At the very core of Dalio's diagnosis is a number so big it's hard to wrap your head around. As of October 2025, the US national debt has surged past a staggering $37.8 trillion. That's over $111,000 for every single person in the country, or over $286,000 per household. It's growing by nearly $6 billion every single day. But for Dalio, this isn't just a number. He uses a powerful medical analogy to describe it. Our national debt is like plaque in the arteries of the economy. This isn't just a dramatic phrase, it's a mechanical description of the crisis. Just as plaque silently builds up in your arteries, constricting blood flow and straining your heart, this mountain of debt is choking the US economy. As the debt grows, the interest payments the government has to make explode. For fiscal year 2025, the interest payments on the national debt totaled $970 billion. That's money that cannot be spent on anything else. Not infrastructure, not education, not research, not defense. It's now the third largest federal government expenditure, surpassing the entire defense budget. The plaque is squeezing out the lifeblood of public investment. For decades, the US managed this debt because interest rates were super low. But that era is over. With interest rates now higher to fight inflation, that plaque is hardening. The Congressional Budget Office projects that debt held by the public, which was already 99% of our gross domestic product, GDP, in 2024, is on track to hit 116% by 2034, a level never before seen in American history. Dalio has warned this could lead to a debt-induced heart attack for the economy. So what does an economic heart attack look like? It starts with a crisis of confidence. The US national debt is held by investors all over the world in the form of treasury bonds. They buy them because they believe they're a safe investment. But as the debt gets too high and the government is forced to either print money or let interest rates spike to pay its bills, that investment doesn't look so safe anymore. At that point, investors will start to sell. If the world loses faith in America's ability to pay its debts, they will dump US bonds. This triggers a death spiral. A mass sell-off would force the US to offer even higher interest rates to find new buyers, which makes the debt even more expensive and accelerates the crisis. If they can't find buyers, the only option left is for the central bank to print trillions of new dollars, unleashing runaway inflation that destroys the savings of ordinary people. This is the scenario Dalio fears, a classic sovereign debt crisis where the world's leading power finds its credit card has been declined. But the debt crisis isn't happening in a vacuum. It's tangled up with an even more volatile force, the fracturing of American society itself. The irreconcilable differences Dalio talks about aren't just political, they're a sign of a nation sorting itself into hostile camps, fueled by economic despair and a profound loss of shared identity. The most obvious symptom of this divide is the political paralysis we see every day. In May 2024, Dalio pointed to this extreme polarization as a key reason we can't solve our problems. This is the civil war in action, a state of constant conflict where the goal isn't to govern, but to beat the other side. Compromise, the engine of democracy, is now seen as weakness. As the government fails to fix real problems like stagnant wages and rising costs, people get angrier, which leads them to seek out more extreme leaders who promise to fight for them, which only deepens the divide. Underneath it all is the staggering inequality of wealth and opportunity. As Dalio bluntly puts it, when there are larger wealth gaps and values gaps, then there are greater conflicts. The top 10% of Americans control over two-thirds of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 50% have less than 4%. For millions, the American dream feels like a lie. They see a system where they work harder for less, while a tiny elite accumulates more and more power. This isn't just a statistic. It's a lived reality that breeds deep resentment. This anger fuels populism on both the left and the right. Both sides tap into it, but they point it at different enemies. For one side, it's a corrupt corporate elite. For the other, it's cultural elites, or a deep state. The target changes, but the emotion is the same, a profound feeling of being left behind by a system that no longer serves them. Dalio sees the closest historical parallel to America's current situation in the years 1937-1938. The world was still reeling from the Great Depression, wealth gaps were enormous, and extremist political movements were gaining power. In many countries, democratic norms buckled under the pressure, and democracies simply stopped being democracies. Dalio warns that the US is veering towards a similar climate where people lose so much faith in the system they become willing to accept an authoritarian leader who promises to restore order even if it means giving up their freedom. To really understand the gravity of Dalio's warning, you have to look at the historical blueprint, and the parallels to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire are chilling. This isn't about predicting an identical collapse, but about recognizing the uncanny echoes of the forces driving the decay. Rome's fall was a slow, grinding process that took generations, and one of the most striking parallels is fiscal mismanagement. To fund endless wars and lavish spending, including the famous bread and circuses to keep the people happy, Roman emperors started devaluing their currency. They minted new coins with less silver, an ancient form of money printing that created hidden inflation. Sound familiar? Today, the US government faces the choice between raising taxes, cutting spending, or printing money to cover its deficits, and printing money is often the easiest political path. Another powerful echo is the hollowing out of the middle class. In the late Roman Republic, huge fortunes were concentrated in the hands of a few powerful senators and generals. This created a two-tiered society, fueling social tension and paving the way for populist leaders who challenged the wealthy elite. Today, we see a similar dynamic as corporate interests and billionaires wield enormous influence over politics, while populist figures on both sides attack a system they call rigged. But maybe the most important parallel is the erosion of political norms. The late Roman Republic still looked like a republic. The Senate met, elections were held. But in reality, true power had shifted to a few strongmen who commanded personal loyalty and private armies. The institutions became a hollow shell, a political theater, while the real decisions were made elsewhere. We can see a modern version of this today. Power is increasingly concentrated not just in government, but in the boardrooms of tech giants. When one billionaire can decide whether a country at war gets access to critical satellite communications, as we saw with Starlink in Ukraine, it's clear a new form of power exists outside the traditional state. The Roman Republic kept calling itself a republic long after it had died. The illusion of continuity masked the reality of rot. That may be the most important lesson from Rome. Empires often decay from the inside out. So, what does the endgame look like? According to Dalio, as these pressures build, a society enters a final chaotic stage. This is a period of escalating conflict he calls tests of power. This is where the simmering civil war boils over, and the fight is no longer contained by laws or political norms. It becomes a raw, bare knuckled struggle for control. These tests of power can take many forms. It could be a contested election where a huge part of the population refuses to accept the result. It could be states openly defying federal laws. It could be the justice system being used as a weapon against political opponents. Each of these events is a test, a moment where one side pushes against the guardrails of democracy to see if they'll break. As Dalio warns, these conflicts will become tests of power by each side. The economic pain from the debt crisis creates the anger and desperation needed for this stage. The deep social polarization provides the armies for this conflict, not soldiers, but citizens convinced their opponents are an existential threat. And the collapse of trust in institutions means there's no neutral referee to settle disputes. In this chaotic environment, the goal is no longer to win a debate, it is to win the fight. The willingness to compromise is replaced by a willingness to do whatever it takes. This is the stage where democracies die. Dalio notes from his study of the 1930s that this is the point where disorder becomes normal and democracies stop being democracies. The desire for stability can become so strong that people become willing to trade their freedom for a leader who promises to impose order, even an autocratic one. The outcome isn't set in stone, but the possibilities are stark. One scenario is a long period of internal strife and economic decline, a slow motion collapse. In a more optimistic scenario, a severe crisis could serve as a wake up call, forcing everyone to pull back from the brink. But Dalio's core message is one of vigilance. If we don't worry about these things, then we have greater risks, he states. The tests of power are the sounds of the machine starting to break apart. What happens next depends on whether anyone is willing to grab the controls before it's too late. After all this, the natural question is, are we doomed? While Dalio's diagnosis is grim, he doesn't entirely close the door on an escape route. His guiding principle, if you worry, you don't have to worry, implies that seeing the danger is the first step to avoiding it. But the solutions would require a level of cooperation and sacrifice that seems almost impossible today. First, we'd have to tackle the economic plaque, the spiraling national debt. Dalio has been clear this would require a mix of unpopular measures, namely big spending cuts and tax hikes. There's no easy way out of a $37.8 trillion debt. It would demand the kind of bipartisan focus the country hasn't seen in decades. But Dalio himself is pessimistic, saying any serious effort will likely come too late. Second, and maybe even harder, would be bridging the irreconcilable differences tearing us apart. This would require a massive shift in our political culture, away from the zero-sum game of populism and back toward compromise. It would mean leaders and citizens choosing to reject the language of us versus them and rebuilding trust in the democratic process itself. Dalio, ever the pragmatist, looks to history. America has faced existential crises before, from the actual Civil War to the Great Depression, and came out stronger. But each of those moments required extraordinary leadership and a sense of shared national identity that rose above factional divides. The big question today is whether that leadership exists, and if enough people can be convinced that preserving the Republic is more important than their own side winning. Ultimately, Dalio doesn't offer a simple solution because there isn't one. His goal is to sound the alarm. The way out is incredibly difficult. Confront the debt with painful fiscal adjustments and at the same time de escalate the internal conflict. Dalio faults both parties for letting the debt get out of control and urges a blended approach to diffuse the deficit debt bomb. While he may be a practical person who is skeptical of idealistic solutions, his repeated warnings are, in themselves, an act of hope. A hope that if we can clearly see the path to ruin, we might just be motivated enough to choose a different one. The forces Ray Dalio describes, debt, division, polarization, can feel overwhelming. But doing nothing is the one thing we can't afford. The first step is to understand what's really going on. Educate yourself. Read Dalio's work. Look at the data on the national debt from nonpartisan sources like the Congressional Budget Office and seek out different perspectives, not to argue, but to understand why people who disagree with you feel the way they do. Second, think locally. We may feel powerless to change the national climate, but we can have a real impact in our own communities. Support local businesses, get involved in local government, and volunteer for groups that are building bridges. Resilient communities are the bedrock of a strong nation. Finally, engage in the conversation constructively. The algorithms want you to be angry, resist it. When you discuss these issues, aim for light, not heat. Ask questions. Listen. What do you think is the biggest driver of division in America today? Is it economic, political, or cultural? Share your thoughts constructively in the comments below. A civil war is the ultimate failure of communication. The path back can begin with a single civil conversation. Ray Dalio's warning isn't a prophecy, it's a diagnosis based on a rigorous study of history and economics. He's showing us a map of where our current path leads, a path that has ended in ruin for great powers of the past. The United States is showing all the classic symptoms of an empire in late-stage decline, a crippling debt load choking its future, a level of wealth inequality fueling social unrest, and a degree of political polarization so severe it has become a civil war of some sort. We are living through the collision of these forces right now. The plaque in the arteries of our debt is hardening. The irreconcilable differences are pushing us towards the final chaotic tests of power. The parallels to the late 1930s and the fall of Rome are not just academic, they are flashing red lights on the dashboard of our republic. To ignore this warning is to choose complacency in the face of an existential threat. The problems are real, the math is unforgiving, and the historical precedents are clear. As Dalio reminds us, the greatest risk lies in not worrying at all. The moment we stop worrying about the fragility of our democracy is the moment we are most likely to lose it. The question is whether this warning will be remembered as the unheeded diagnosis of a collapse or the alarm bell that finally woke a nation up.